And now please join me as we welcome Dr. Louisa Moats.
There we are. Good morning, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here. I'm so honored and privileged to be speaking to this gathering today. I admire the work of the Reading League tremendously, and I thank you all for indulging me for the next hour. I've chosen to speak about the journey that I personally went on because there's so many people in the audience who already know everything that I know about teaching reading, and because I'm sort of at the end or writing the last chapter of my career, I thought it might amuse you, if nothing else, to hear about really how I got here today. All right, this is supposed to work. Oh, it has to go on. I think that's, oh, it is on? Oh, okay. All right. When I earned my master's degree in 1968, in the first program that was called a program in learning disabilities, these are the things that I was taught about and that I understood. First of all, we were told that we were to diagnose and look for the syndrome called minimal brain dysfunction if kids couldn't read or weren't learning very well. We were taught about visual and sensory motor therapies, so that in the first job I had as a learning specialist in the Nashville Public Schools, I advised the principal to buy the Frostig visual motor materials for all of the first graders, thinking and saying in all sincerity that that would fix all the reading problems that the children had been demonstrating. Whoops, trying to advance this, and this does not seem to be advancing. There we go. I was also told that there were lots of ways to teach reading, and selecting one was a matter of sort of a personality test. That if you were a humanist and a liberal, you would pick the language experience approach, and if you were a sort of uptight anal person, you would pick direct instruction. We were also told to give a survey of learning styles to our students so that we could determine if they were visual, auditory, or kinesthetic learners. I want to advance this, okay? And then I was told, your job is not to teach reading, it's to fix the learning problems. Well, as you can imagine, I wasn't very effective with my students. And at the time, one of the ways of teaching spelling that we learned about was from the 1950s. And as you can see on this slide, this is from the Word Book, and this was the visual memory approach to spelling. And you may recognize that it's kind of similar to a lot of things that are still going on in our classrooms today. Whoops. So, ignore that. How to study a word you missed. Look at the word and say it softly. Look at the word and say the letter softly. Close your eyes and say the letter softly, not loud. Write the word without looking to see how it's spelled in your book. Look at your book to see if you got the word right, and keep trying until you get the word right. That was a method. Okay. Also, diagnostically, we were taught to use what was called, at the time, the Illinois Test of Psycholinguistic Ability. It may still be in a catalog somewhere, and my recommendation is don't buy it. The description was, it measured reception, expression, and intermediate process of organizing symbols and concepts, as well as levels of organization, i.e., the degree to which responses are automatic or require the rational translation of symbols into meaning and response. By the way, that's gobbledygook. Well, after a few years, I was kind of dissatisfied with my with my career as a special educator, and I had a sideline as a songwriter and singer, and I did evening gigs, and it was lots of fun. And so when I turned 30, I had been working in California. I went back to Nashville with all my stuff in my car, deciding I was going to be a songwriter because the special ed stuff was inherently dissatisfying, as you can imagine. And I got a contract to write songs for Screen Gems Columbia Music for $50 a week. So I had to moonlight as a special educator in the school where the country music stars sent their kids. And one of those was Johnny Cash. So I evaluated Johnny Cash's son, and with my gobbledygook test, and we had a parent conference, and it was just me and Johnny. And I was mature and professional. I did not push any of my songs on him. However, after our parent conference, which probably to him was quite alarming, he promptly withdrew his son from the school. There I am. All right. Okay, then, after a year as a songwriter, I decided that wasn't for me. So I went back to Boston, got my old job at the New England Medical Center as a learning specialist, and my boss said, look, you have to get a doctorate because we can't keep you in this job unless you get a doctorate. So I thought, okay, Harvard's down the street, I'll apply and see if they take me. And they did take me. So I walked into the first class with Dr. Carol Chomsky in 1977. She was Noam Chomsky's wife, and she was my linguistics professor. And she required all of the master's and doctoral students at the Harvard Grad School to take a course called Introduction to Language. And this was the textbook we had, the Fromkin and Rodman textbook, An Introduction to Language. And this was the moment I began to learn something that was valuable and something that changed my life. This woman knew that all of us could never be respectable, informed reading specialists unless we had studied language, and I am so grateful to her. She made me learn for the first time. Is this going to work? Yes. She made us learn the speech sounds of English, and I promise you, until that moment, and I had been in the field then for approximately 10 years, I thought that letters made sounds. You know how teachers talk about that? Letters make sounds. And my concept of the sound structure of language was what the letters were and what the letters represented. And this simple difference, being shown the organization of the speech sound system and getting some insight into what phonology was all about, really changed my life. The idea that sounds have features, articulatory features, the idea that those features allow us to classify speech sounds into those that are similar and those are different, the idea that speech sounds are overlapping in their featural characteristics, and therefore there are some that are more confusable than others. And all of a sudden, it was like this curtain of confusion being lifted off my mind. And I understood that, for example, the second consonant in the word ink is not n, but it is the third nasal sound. I had gotten that far in life without understanding really that there was a third nasal speech sound in English because of the vagaries of our spelling system. And even more enlightening was the idea that there are 19 vowel sounds, 19 vowel phonemes in the English language, because all of us as reading teachers are always taught that a vowel is A, E, I, O, or U. And to make sense of it as an array of sounds that have certain properties and that are similar and different in particular ways was an absolute revelation. And then I had to learn something else. And this is best articulated by a quote from Al Lieberman, who was, of course, the eminent scientist at the Haskins Laboratories, who, as I was learning about language for the first time, was with Isabel Lieberman and Don Shankweiler and others at Haskins, who I think mentored Benita Blackman also, was explaining why this thing we call phoneme awareness, or they were calling phoneme awareness, was difficult for kids to learn. So this is a wonderful quote, and if you come to understand this, you will be well on your way to expertise. So it says this: children faced with the task of learning to read in an alphabetic script cannot be assumed to understand that letters represent phonemes, because awareness of the phoneme as a linguistic object is not part of their easily accessible mental calculus, and because its existence is obscured by the physical properties of the speech stream. This is a profound observation. And what does it mean in practice? It means that phonemes are elusive entities psychologically. For example, the first sound in dress is not d. It's an affricated sound that you pucker your mouth to make. The first sound in train is not t, it's ch. The middle sound in nature is not t, it's ch. As we say the word naturally, the middle sound in ladder and ladder is a tongue flap. The last syllables in better, button, and buckle are what we call syllabic consonants. You can't hear a separate vowel in what we articulate. And so to tell students that every syllable has a vowel is in itself a bit problematic. It might have a vowel letter, but to say it has an audible vowel sound is what I call a phonics fiction. And so on, okay? And, there we go. And this was graphically illustrated by Isabel Lieberman in a talk I heard her give while I was in graduate school. I had never seen a spectrograph before. And here is a spectrographic readout of words we can say that all supposedly start with a so-called short E vowel: elephant, egg, and echo. And you can see, just looking at the frequencies that come out of our mouths as we say these sounds, that the acoustical properties of the so-called eh sound differ significantly in these words. And the one that has the purest form of eh is echo, and you can see that there's a slight pause. That white space in the word echo is when we get ready to say the stop, the voiceless stop consonant k that follows the eh, and that causes the vowel to be sort of pure, not distorted. Whereas in egg, and I still see many publishers that use egg as a keyword for eh. It is the sound that comes out of your mouth in egg is really a long a. And why is that? Because your tongue comes up in anticipation of the g and forces that vowel sound up. Now, if that went by you too fast, just get some letters training, please. All right. So with these insights, I could then begin to look at spelling as what it is, which is a representation of what the child is processing at a phonological level and what the child knows about orthography blended together in a representation of aspects of language. It is not a visual memory exercise. So here we have a first grader, and besides believing that all of the words have 3 letters, which I find curious because, you know, these phenomena are right in front of us, and yet people don't see them. If spelling were just a visual memory exercise, then the student would vary the number of letters in the word, because just looking at print, words have different numbers of letters. But this student is trying conceptually to manage the act of spelling and puts 3 letters for each word, and you can see this student has no idea about the short vowels and the identity of the short vowels in the words. Furthermore, the student makes several phonological confusions. If you look at number 4, the last sound in mob is the voiced b, but the student writes the voiceless p, which is, I think, not a visual error, but a phonological one. And also the word coach, number 13, the student writes a G for j instead of ch. And the relationship between these sounds is that they are voiceless pairs, and so on. I could analyze this for half an hour, but you haven't given me that much time. But anyway, the point is that there it all is in language processing written down. That's why I got very hooked on spelling and wrote my dissertation about it. However, back to Carol Chomsky, so 3 days before graduation, after I'd labored for 5 years, and she was my dissertation advisor, she sat me down, and I'd written this great dissertation about phonetic spelling errors, and she said, "Louisa," with a scowl on her face, "I think you still do not understand what a phoneme is." And I was, at that point, terrified, and I said, "Can I graduate anyway?" And she was very kind and said, "Yes, but you have to keep studying because there are different layers of representation of phonemes in the brain, and you don't really understand that yet." So she was absolutely right. It took me another 10, 15, 20 years to get that. Okay, so I was very fortunate. I lived in rural Vermont, and I was in private practice. I became a psychologist so that I could do something. And I lived there, and at the same time, when I was a psychologist in Vermont, Reed Lyon, who became the director of the NICHD Reading Research Program, was also in Vermont, and Vermont is a small state, so we encountered one another in various policy meetings and State Department meetings and so on, because I think I was the only person in Vermont with a doctorate in reading that I can remember. So we became colleagues, and he invited me to participate in the NICHD research program when he became director. And I want to point out, when we talk about the research, for those of you who may be relatively new to this field, the research network just funded to the tune of at least $500 million of taxpayer money over about 30 or 40 years. It's a vast network of scientists across disciplines working together and generating thousands of papers and book chapters to explain the nature of reading. And David Kilpatrick has summarized all of it in a way we can understand. But all of this work, and Benita Blackman's name is on there, and so I got recruited to be the project director for one of these studies. And I also want to show you this. This was all of us assembled by Reed Lyon in about 1992, 93 in Washington, and our job was to formulate a series of questions that needed to be answered by research and some ideas about how a research program may be organized and carried out. And you can see all of us look a lot younger, and I am way in the back there. I'm trying to hide because I didn't really think that I deserved to be there among all those eminences. But many of those people became lifelong colleagues and friends and indulged me over the years for my relative lack of training in scientific methodologies, and I had to learn the hard way by working with people like Jack Fletcher how a study is actually conducted. All right, so to put it all on one slide, these are things that we painstakingly learned from many studies over years, and they're simple things like this. English orthography represents sound, pattern, and meaning at various levels all at the same time. Reading and spelling develop in phases. Thank heavens for Linnea Erie's work in particular. Reading and spelling are language skills, not visual memory processes primarily. Phoneme awareness is the essential underpinning for learning to read words in an alphabetic orthography, and code-based instruction works the best, especially for the lower end of the continuum, but it's the best approach for all students. So while it's easy to summarize all these things on a slide, we're talking about dozens, hundreds of studies that have converged on these basic findings that we've been able to say are sort of settled science since the National Reading Report in the year 2000. Whoops, there we go. All right, so the National Reading Panel report capitalized on this research base, tremendous research base. I shouldn't say tremendous, it reminds me of Donald Trump. All right, so major research findings about instruction. Teach all major components explicitly. Phoneme awareness instruction is effective in reducing the risk of reading failure on into the future of a child's life. Systematic and explicit instruction in the code system of written English is what is going to work the best for most kids, starting very early, and daily exposure to a variety of texts, as well as incentives for children to read independently and with others, is a good practice. All right, and since this was marked as very controversial by people who didn't want to hear the message, in case you need more reinforcement for these points, just go to Barbara Foreman's summary report for the What Works Clearinghouse in the practice guide that was published in 2016. And she said, we're building on the findings of the National Reading Panel and summarizing all the studies that have come since. And that's just a more detailed explanation of what these points mean in practice. So while all this was going on, I also began to realize, mainly because I was trying to teach other people about teaching reading, how important it is to have theoretical models that hold up over time. And one of the ones that's been so valuable that I really was not aware of, again, until about 1990, again, when I heard a colleague give a talk, and that colleague was Phyllis Fisher, who ended up being at the University of Maine, but who I think has trained some, a professor who trained some people who are probably in this room. But she flashed this up in the beginning of a talk, and she said, look, this should orient everything we do. This simple model that comes from Mark Seidenberg's book, and you can see that it is held up to scientific scrutiny over years. It's still in Mark Seidenberg's book in 2017, and this is from, I think, 1989 when he first published it. But it's a powerful model, and what has occurred to me over time is how important it is to have simple models that orient everything you do. And then I realized, we make a poster of this, realized that for years, to try to get people to understand phonology, we were very focused on the phonological processor. And then now, in the last maybe 5 years or so, we've become much more thoughtful about what the orthographic processor does, how it learns, what it has to learn, and its interaction with the other processing systems. So it took me a very long time to get this, way past my doctoral program, but now I'm fully convinced that when we look at a word like that, which you read instantly, right, unreachable, that what's going on in the brain is a recognition, a rapid recognition of all of these levels of language structure, thank you, the morphemes, the syllables, the graphemes, and the letters. And it's the graphemes that represent the phonemes. It is not letters that represent the phonemes. And that key insight took me decades to develop the idea, because I had not seen a definition of what a grapheme was. There was a lot of confusion about that. A grapheme is not a letter. A grapheme is a representational unit. It represents a phoneme in a spoken word, and that's a key concept if you're going to learn how to teach reading. As Charles Perfetti said, and I have to read you this, Charles Perfetti, who talks about high-quality lexical representations in our memory. Quote, "It is the level of language that provides the interface to written words in an alphabetic writing system. Graphic units map onto phonological units that can be phonemes or syllables. The basic units of alphabetic writing are graphemes. Without sensitivity to the phonemic structure of language and without word representations in memory that include clearly specified phonemes, there will be a problem mapping graphemes to phonemes." That's from Perfetti, 2011. All right, so what I'm trying to describe to you is that the process of insights that I've been able to gain by virtue of how lucky I've been to be in contact with people who are the real scientists, and I'm really the translator. It's a long, drawn-out process. It's a process of continual growth and building insights into how all this works, because it's counterintuitive. Well, after the National Reading Panel report, thanks to the Bush family, and I'm saying the Bush family because the reason we had reading first, starting with President Bush's first day in office, was that his mother, Barbara, and his wife, Laura, were avid proponents of reading instruction that works, and they were pushing him behind the scenes to make reading a priority in his first presentation to Congress, which was the bill that nobody wants to deal with anymore. But reading first was really powerful, and it gave money to states for implementing the right kind of instruction. So after a few years of reading first, I was together with my colleagues in Texas once, and somebody took this picture, and we're all smiling. We look so happy. It's like, and so that's Jack Fletcher in the back on the left, Joe Torgeson, Reed Lyon, and Emerson Dickman, who was the president of the IDA at the time. And then there's me looking a lot younger, and there's Pat Mathis and Marilyn Adams and Marcia Sonnenberg, who was the Reading First director in Fort Worth. But it strikes me, we all look so like we've accomplished something. We really created some real progress, we thought. And so the rest of the story here is important. All right, so then there was all the controversy about reading first, and now if you go to certain meetings, you hear that reading first was an utter failure, right? But so we dug up some of the papers that actually did the analysis of reading first in various states, and you should be aware that this literature exists because everybody's forgotten about it. So this was a paper published in the Journal of Literacy Research in 2010 by Bean et al. And Naomi Zygmunt was on this as the evaluator. The Pennsylvania, Michigan, Utah, and Florida evaluations examined student achievement outcomes for third graders in schools over the 5 years, implementation and outcome data for the groups as a whole, for disaggregated groups of third graders, and for third graders who received reading instruction in Reading First schools for 1, 2, and 3 years were collected. All 4 states made significant gains in reading comprehension. And actually, I have all the data on a set of slides, and if anyone's compulsive enough to need that, I can dig it up for you. And then another paper by David Pearson, which was published in 2010 in the Journal of Literacy Research as well. And if you don't know reading politics, David Pearson was a president of the International Reading Association at the time and was very reluctant to embrace reading first. There were a lot of people in the International Reading Association that were constantly criticizing it, standing up, screaming at national meetings about how it wasn't addressing comprehension enough and so on. So David Pearson was a reluctant reviewer, but this is what he had to conclude. The consistent message is that reading first worked, at least as measured by the criteria used to evaluate its impact on school programs, professional development, teacher practices, and student achievement, as if there were any other way to evaluate it. By and large, teachers appreciated the various programs. Notice the parentheses, all variations on the, quote, Big Five theme, which, they didn't really like. They liked and responded well to the staff development provided and implemented the key components of the enabling legislation, the Big Five, and a progress monitoring system in all 4 states. Okay, the Reading First advantage extended to the lowest achieving students. Many states noted substantial reductions in the percentage of students scoring below their basic cut scores. In fact, in some states, there was some evidence of actually closing the achievement gap, although it must be recognized that Reading First seemed to benefit students at all levels of prior achievement and demographic factors. Now, so if you hear somebody at a meeting standing up and saying Reading First was an utter failure, just please cite David Pearson's article, because it wasn't. It was working. It was just a long, hard slog. I know in the Bureau of Indian Education, for example, they doubled the number of students in those schools who reached proficient levels in reading. It was just dramatic. Okay, all right. So, did we learn from this? Did we learn from this experiment with national tax dollars given to states? Well, one would wonder, and why? It's something we're talking about all the time. Why didn't we just keep going with it? Well, I thought this quote, which I got from a colleague, was telling, and I have to reflect all the time on this phenomenon. It's a wonderful quote about our attitude towards science. It's by Boyce Rensberger. Quote, Americans are overwhelmingly interested in science, but don't understand it and know even less about how it's done. Without a grasp of scientific ways of thinking, the average person cannot tell the difference between science based on real data and something that resembles science, at least in their eyes, but is based on uncontrolled experiments, anecdotal evidence, and passionate assertions. They like it all. So given that as sort of a context, along came the Common Core. And the Common Core, I was really hopeful. I thought, well, Reading First has been such a success. We've moved all these high-poverty schools along. The data are there. Let's build on it. So yes, we can enrich comprehension instruction now because we know how to get the foundations in place. Well, that's not what happened. And the influence of the Common Core document, and sometimes when I say I had a role in writing it, I did. Marilyn Adams and I drafted the foundational reading skills section, but we had no control over the final document, the organization of it, or the wording in the final document. And I was really dismayed. And actually, in the first meetings we had about the document after it was published, I protested to David Coleman and David Lieben, who were really the movers and shakers behind the document. But look at what happened. The foundational skills were put in the back, so Lucy Calkins could then say, thank God we don't have to pay attention to those anymore. And then the phoneme awareness was separated from language, perpetuating the myth again that language is something other than reading, and phoneme awareness is this orphan topic that doesn't really belong anywhere. It said that phoneme awareness should be all over by grade 1. that kids should be fluent readers by grade 2, in spite of all the data we have on the growth of reading, and that higher level language comprehension should be just sort of infused in the lower grades as they are in the upper grades. Well, in my humble opinion, the Common Core has, especially in the first 4 or 5 years of it, really caused a lot of people to totally abandon all of the scientifically based instruction that had gone on during Reading First and disregard the progress there and really cause us to regress. And a little side note, a happier end to that story is that David Lieben, who was with David Coleman, a prime mover of and writer of the final document, out of the blue 2 years ago sent me an email, and he said, I'm David Lieben, and blah, blah, blah. I was thinking, I know who you are. And he apologized to me for the mistakes they made in the way the document was drafted. And he said, you know, we're out doing school consultation all the time, and we're seeing that the teachers have no clue how to teach reading. And I was thinking, duh, you know, you promoted that idea that they don't need to teach kids how to read. But I give him enormous credit for admitting an error in leadership and guidance, and now he's working vigorously to correct that. So we're in a correction mode at this point, and I'm very grateful for that. And there are programs coming down the pike now that are much better written with a much wiser approach to the different components. Okay, so meanwhile, the National Council on Teacher Quality, a wonderful organization, was bringing to light something that I had started complaining about in 1994 with the first paper I ever wrote about the missing foundation in teacher education. And they documented the really poor quality of a lot of the courses that teachers had to take to teach reading, and cited the prevalence of postmodernism, said that many colleges of education remain wedded to unscientific and or anti-scientific perspectives. They talked about how a teacher's experience, anecdotal stories, and promotion of philosophy were all valued above scientific research. And then, as many of you probably know, they did a much larger study of that nature in 2013, surveying many institutions, and found that only 29% of the syllabi that they reviewed and the programs they reviewed addressed 4 or 5 of the big 5 topics in reading. And then as far as preparing teachers to teach kids with reading problems, only 22% qualified as having even the basic information that teachers would need to begin to teach kids with reading difficulties. And that was not a positive report. And of course, there are some states that have subsequently done a really great job looking at what's going on in teacher education. And I have to give a shout out to the state of Mississippi right here. Whoa, all right. For doing the unimaginable, which is getting the professors who teach the courses for teachers in a course to learn what they should have learned all along. Okay. So, and it amuses me, many of you have seen this wonderful article by Emily Hanford that came out in September that described what was going on in Mississippi, and also described the mentality of the resistors, which was kind of curious. But then Emily Hanford, this wonderful reporter who took 2 years to study this topic and who knows more about reading than most reading professionals I've ever met. She's very, very smart. But she had to condense the article, kind of the main points, for an article that was in the New York Times op-ed on Sunday. Did anybody see that? Yes, good for you. Okay. And she had to sort of condense the main points. So her final point is this: there is no excuse for this. Colleges of education have to start requiring that their faculties teach the science of reading. Children's futures depend on it. In the New York Times op-ed, yes. I was really thrilled. It was my birthday, too, so it really made me happy. But to be that blunt and that forceful and that declarative and to get published in the Times was, I think, tremendously positive step in the right direction. Meanwhile, what goes on in our classrooms? And this is so stunning to me, and I always puzzle about it. People ask me, and I can't explain it. In almost every classroom you walk into that's been doing guided reading or balanced literacy, you see a word wall where it's organized alphabetically, and this is a teacher who is extremely diligent because she's making it pretty, she's using color coding, she's diligently cutting out the outline around each word under the letter T. And the problem is that the first letter T is not going to help kids read these words. What you have to know to read these words is the phoneme-grapheme correspondences and the fact that TH represents th, not t. It's so fundamental, and yet the puzzle is why thousands of teachers buy into this without thinking of the absurdity or without knowing that teaching kids to read involves teaching them the phoneme-grapheme correspondences bit by bit in the beginning. It's also puzzling to me that this practice is so widespread and all over YouTube and all over the direction manuals for teachers. How do you, what kind of corrective feedback do you give if a student doesn't know a word? You say, don't know that word? Well, just keep reading and see what might make sense here. And cover up the word. How about that? Cover up the word and read the sentence and see what might make sense. And then look at the picture. And what do you think it might be? And then, well, if you have to, look at the first letter, see if that gives you a little help. And then as a last resort, and this one's in the latest reading Bible I saw, with the lesson plan, and in parentheses at the very end, it's sound it out if you really have to. But what puzzles me, and we all know you wouldn't be here if you believed in that, probably. But the puzzle is, why do people buy into this? Why do people buy into this? Why aren't the teachers saying, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Furthermore, it isn't working for a lot of my kids. And I think it's because these are pretty complex things that are going on in our brain that you can't see. They're hidden processes. They're automatic for those of us who can read. And the idea that knowledge of word form is related to knowledge of word meaning, this is just not understood at all. And again, this is a quote from Charles Perfetti, that thank you, that to know a word, you have to know both its form and its meaning, and all of that is of a package, and those linguistic properties interact with one another. They are not separate. And so to the extent that we even separate these components from one another, the big five, that's kind of an illusion. We do that for the sake of organizing instruction, but it's not the reality of the human brain. So back to my career, I have been nothing if not redundant in what I have to say about all this. And I did notice in 1994, in the first paper I wrote for Annals of Dyslexia on the missing foundation in teacher education, I was simply disturbed by the fact that the wonderful graduate students who were coming to my course didn't know the first thing about language structure or what a phoneme was. And of course, by that time, I thought everybody ought to know it, forgetting that I didn't have a clue myself for years and years. So over the years, I kept writing basically the same thing. And I guess the last one was for the Australian Journal in 2014, which is also about teacher knowledge. And it always amuses me that people like the paper called Teaching Reading is Rocket Science, which I did with the American Federation of Teachers. Because I published it with the American Federation of Teachers, I had a nice lady in Texas say to me once, I'm afraid you're a communist because you wrote this with a teacher union. That was pretty funny. But I want you all to know that while I have been vocal on this issue of what teachers need to know and the importance of language structure, I have many more colleagues who are dyed-in-the-wool researchers who picked up the theme and actually did the work of documenting in good scientific studies what I was talking about conceptually. And those people include Louise Spear-Swerling, Ann Cunningham, Susan Brady, Erin Washburn, Emily Binks-Cantrell, Deborah McCutcheon, Malt Joshi, and others. Okay, so there was all this. But we would find astonishing things in these surveys. This one, we had 900 teachers take a survey in one of the states we're working in, and the question was simple. How is the word glue divided? Is it syllable, onset, rhyme, phoneme, or none of the above? And while our guidelines are full of references to onset and rhyme, only 37% of licensed practicing teachers could identify that this word was divided by onset and rhyme. And this one is a little more challenging, as you can see by the success rate being 24%. But the question is, which of the following groups of words is an example of the spelling principle we spell by the position of a sound in a word? So to get this, you have to see that the position of a phoneme-grapheme correspondence has changed and that the different graphemes represent the same phoneme, which the answer is B. But if 24% of our teachers can identify this, we're in trouble when it comes to teaching spelling. And another study, which I had nothing to do with, was from Speech, Hearing, and Language in the Schools by Spencer, Shuley, and Guyat. And they looked at the relationship between speech-language pathologists' ability to segment these words and teachers' ability to segment these words. What I want to point out is that we can never assume that anybody understands what a phoneme is or how to segment words by phoneme until we have taught them what the phonemes are and given them a lot of coaching in how to do this. The error rates here are pretty striking. This is not easy. And when Patricia Lindemood was still alive, she would take me aside, and she was always scolding me because she didn't think I knew what I was talking about. And she was always scolding me and telling me about this, and I didn't want to believe her. She said, look, speech and language pathologists need work on this too. And we would do little experiments with audiences, and she would show me that phoneme awareness is very elusive for adults as well as kids, and we need to keep that in mind. So I love this cartoon. We have lots of information technology, we just don't have any information. And that's it. We have all these structures around teaching reading, but often we never bother to teach people what they need to know about the structure of language in order to understand the psychology of reading and how to teach it, in spite of hundreds of millions of dollars of research. So just a few references to the studies that have been done by others that were very striking to me. Shane Piasta et al. In Scientific Studies of Reading did a study that showed that if teachers really don't understand what they're doing, it doesn't matter if you give them a good scripted program because they will not be able to get results with it. Teaching is translating information for students so that they understand it. And even giving a scripted program to teachers who do poorly on their own knowledge, who don't know what they're doing, is not going to get a result. So to the extent that you can emphasize teacher knowledge first, before programs, you're likely to get a better result. And then, of course, this very bold paper by these people in Scientific Studies of Reading that showed that in the schools they work with, probably in Texas, I'm just guessing, that the professors who taught the courses were surprisingly unaware of language structure at various levels. And some of the striking results of the survey they gave to the professors was, in the bottom item, the number of phonemes in the word frogs. Only 29% of the professors knew that the word frogs has 2 morphemes in it. So of course, the teachers they're teaching don't do any better on their survey. And what's striking about this is the correspondence between the knowledge of the professors and then the knowledge gained by the teachers in their courses. All right, so why are well-prepared teachers hard to find? Often the standards for entry into programs are low. Often the course content is inappropriate. Often there are no requirements for language study. Often the concepts themselves are very difficult and complex and elusive, and they take time and practice to learn. You cannot get phonology in a 1-hour overview. It's impossible. So, to wind up here, and this one, application requires mentoring, coaching, and appropriate tools for teaching. Okay, so are we there yet? This has been personally a very long journey for me. And I'm often asked why haven't we arrived? We have all this science. Why aren't people exploiting it and doing better? So these are some things that I think are positive about where we've been since I started out. The PH words have entered our vocabulary, although they are often misused. But when I started, the PH words, phonology was unknown. Phoneme awareness was unknown. We do have dyslexia guidelines in about 40-some states now, for better or for worse. It's a step in the right direction, although there are problems that have come with those. Parent advocacy is stronger than ever, and these groups have been very successful in promoting awareness and better guidelines and policies. The Common Core state standards leaders now are coming around to a more informed, more helpful view of what needs to be happening, thank heavens. We have new comprehensive programs coming online that are probably better teaching tools. And we have the Reading League doing the most fabulous work. I'm so pleased at everything I hear. We have the International Dyslexia Association's Knowledge and Practice Standards, which have been revised and which are going to be the underpinning for an accreditation and certification process. We have heard that 100 institutions have lined up to go through that accreditation process, which is very encouraging. I have a fabulous community of letters colleagues and trainers, some of whom are here today, who are out there doing all this great work in schools, some of it around here. I'm so grateful to them. They teach me and inspire me day in and day out. So I will conclude with this. I think if I live long enough, I don't know, maybe I'll look like this person, and maybe I'll be able to say, hey, it's all coming together and things are really changing. But I am optimistic, and especially am so grateful for all that you are doing. So I will leave you with this thought from Rosa Parks. Whoops, there it is. Anyway, if we can go back to that one. Yes, Rosa Parks. We are not where we want to be. We are not where we're going to be, but we are not where we were. So thank you so much.